Hello and happy Thursday, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another Andrew Joseph PR curated Aspire webinar. The last webinar that we did with Melissa Metag and Shemin Taylor-Smith on when your business is ready for a business coach. One of the underlining topics that was discussed with Shemin and Melissa was the importance of branding. And here we have three superb experts in the field. We have Sarah von Dreele, and we have Erika and Julian of Lemon Yellow. I'm going to let them say a little bit about themselves and let the conversation begin. As a special note, next week is kind of a big week in the US. There's this little thing called an election that's happening. And we've decided to not have a webinar next week because I feel like there's going to be a lot of energy spent around voting and the outcome. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining. And remember, there is a chat and Q&A at the bottom. So any questions you have, we'll address them at the end. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an honor to be a part of this talk and also to be doing this with Sarah. I'm Erika with Lemon Yellow. I'm one of the partners, and I'm here sitting down with Julian as well.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah. So we've been around for 15 years, and we're based out of Miami. We've now also launched an LA West Coast office as well, which we're really excited about. And we've really just, been cemented, I think, in the community by, a studio that really believes in logical, clean, intelligent design. So that's mainly what we're known for.
Yeah, that sums it up. I mean, we have a very focused portfolio spanning right back to the very beginning. We've always really stuck to our guns in terms of the output of the studio. We always wanted it to be something that we were proud to look back on.
Mm-hmm. As graphic designers and working specifically in the branding field, we also have a big love for industrial design. So we work quite a bit with architects and interior designers, both at doing architectural related projects and bringing in our branding knowledge to those, but also rebranding architects, interior designers. So we have a great collaboration with them as well.
We're actually at Architectonica right now.
Yeah, we were here all morning, actually interviewing Bernardo for Brescia, so we didn't have enough time to rush back to the studio, so we're taking the call from here.
But they're very, very gracious with us, and it's maybe my favorite office in Miami next to ours. But
yeah.
Well, it's certainly sunnier there than it is here in New York City today.
Erika mentioned that we're graphic designers, and that's really how we started. And the trajectory of the studio really was, it was always a branding studio, but the branding side of it matured over the course of time.
We didn't mature, but the studio matured.
Yeah, we're still very immature. But, when we started the studio, it was during this time when advertising was really that was where the money was at. And Eric and I were really we were interested in advertising peripherally, but we were more interested in branding. And certainly whenever we do advertising, it is from a brand-centric perspective. So we were early on just on the same page in terms of wanting to really focus on doing strategic work. And what that means for us is it allowed us to do design that was very reduced, that was very essential, that was very pared down, because we had a very clear idea of what we were trying to say. And
that's something we're going to talk about today, because I think it's really challenging for companies that are either starting out or even if you've been around for a while. How do you develop a consistent, cohesive message, right? And how do you do this without saying, you know, something in a repetitive, monotonous way? But how do you establish consistency and focus, and can allow people to recognize you for something, you know, over time, and, you know, avoid being all over the place? And the best word we found for that was, you know, really just the schizophrenic kind of situation, which, you know, we see quite a bit, you know, in having things that are kind of all saying different things, whether it's your website, your logo, your tone of voice, your photography, you know, finding these moments where things are just disjointed, or, you know, there are gaps, right? So I think that especially when people are getting started, you know, you're focusing on logistics, and seldom do you really sit down and say, hey, you know, let's talk about, you know, what our brand concept is, you know, what is our brand vision, what is going to be our brand personality, what will, you know, our tone of voice be, how are we going to do X, Y, and Z from a communication standpoint. Those things sometimes tend to take a back seat because you're more worried about these actual logistics, and how am I going to make money, and how am I going to pay the rent, and you know, get this world, you know, started. And
so maybe we should touch upon why you would want to have consistent messaging.
Yeah, and I think before we jump into that, we didn't let Sarah introduce herself, so I will let Sarah talk a little bit about her, so we don't hog up this entire intro.
I think between the three of us, we could talk about all this stuff until the cows come home, right? Hang on one second. I have a 4th grader here. One second, Juliet. What's up?
So it's not letting me on. I've been waiting for like 7.
Okay, send your teachers an email. We're doing homeschool this week, and we made it 7 weeks in person, but we're making it work. We're making it work.
This is the beauty of Zoom that you don't get in an in-person conference or meeting, and I love this because reality and you know, everything coming together. So
yes, it's life. So my background is in corporate and consumer branding. I have a BFA in graphic design, and so for the last 20 years and the last 15, I've had a consultancy of my own. But 5 years ago, I started painting just for personal reasons, as a way to kind of clear my head. And it has turned into a product brand to the trade. So I now have a line of wallpaper and textiles, along with several licensing agreements for consumer products. So I kind of have one toe still in consultancy. I have 1 or 2 clients that I've worked with for a very long time. But my focus is really on developing my product brand. So I'm kind of a bit of a bridge, I think, for our audience between your practice, product design, and in the interiors space. And so I'm excited to talk about these things with you, and really help designers who might be thinking about either starting over and developing their brand, or even refreshing and looking for strategic ways to evolve it. You know, I think there's a lot of information that we can unpack here. So, I mean, I have a question for you all, maybe as a good starting point, is, you know, in your practice, you know, very simply, if a designer were to come to your office and say, you know, how do you define branding? Like, very simply, what are the most important things for your studio? Because I think that sets the tone for your process. And what I know about your studio, there is a very methodical process, and I think there's a lot of value to bringing in those outside eyes and ears, because with all of your brains, it's really about kind of putting those questions out into the universe, and having that partner to help you understand who you are as a company, what your DNA is, so that there's a really solid foundation for exploring what that becomes and how that lives. So
yeah, it's a great question. I don't know if you want to answer that, kick it off, or you want me to answer it?
I once saw this interview with Dreele where he said something on the subject that I thought was very appropriate. They asked him about branding, and he said, I don't know what that is. I think in terms of I'm paraphrasing obviously, but he said he thinks of it in terms of the name, as in, do you have a good name or not? And I think it's interesting because more than anything, the name of a company or organization is really the carrier. It's the vessel for all of the expectation that is associated with that entity, right? And that's really what branding is about for us, is this idea that you're managing expectation, and there's a real value to that. And it's the difference between a commodity and a brand. A commodity is something that's bought and sold based on market value, right? It's just rice, beans, coffee, steel.
Yeah.
And once you take a series of ideas, a series of stories, a narrative, and you imbue that, you start to have a brand. And what that does is it creates expectation in terms of the kind of products or services that you can anticipate, whether they be good or bad, and also like the personality. And most of the time, when you think of a company, if you take a publicly traded company and you add up all their hard assets, they're usually a fraction of the actual value of that company. Everything else is intangible. Everything else is purely expectation in the consumer's mind. So, and it's the lion's share of the value of that company. So managing that and building it up really is what branding is all about.
Right. So what is that feeling that people have, right? Like when you say a brand name, or, you know, that essentially is really, you know, what the brand, you know, is. And of course there's the name is you know, is key. But there's everything that follows with the name. So a brand is not a logo. You know, a logo is obviously part of a brand. The name is a crucial part, but it's really very much about that expectation that people have in their minds. And, you know, that is where, you know, the brand equity essentially, you know, will live. So yeah, I hope.
In the beginning of that process, when you're working with a client, maybe you could talk a little bit about what are you talking about in those conversations to kind of help draw out that information to begin to understand conceptually what this brand is.
Yeah. So we typically kick it off with a series of questions, and they're not, you know, they're not necessarily straightforward questions. And we're not necessarily asking you, what is your brand concept? What is your brand vision? Because, you know, if we're asking that and you have it, you know, you don't really need us, right? Like our job is to really be able to distill this information through our conversations with you and ask, you know, certain key questions that are then going to allow us to arrive. But it's also not that we're making something up, right? Like, you know, in order for branding to be effective, and it should be truthful, it should be something that is grounded on, you know, on some brand truth. So, you know, our job is really to have these conversations and make sure we can ask the right questions so that we're doing something objectively and not subjectively, and that we are able to, what we call getting to know you, and really just trying to understand, you know, what is at the heart of the brand. Now, that leads me to, you know, you're probably very familiar with terms such as your brand values and your brand mantra and your tagline. And, you know, those are all constituent parts of the brand. But in order, you know, to bring it back to this idea of avoiding, you know, schizophrenic branding and messaging, you know, one of the things that I think is really key to focus on is your brand concept, first and foremost, because this is essentially what's going to outline and lay out a blueprint for you to follow, and, you know, make sure that all your communications, be it verbal or visual, can all say and point to the same thing. So when you think about brand concept, one of the easiest, sorry, was there, somebody said something? Was there one of the easiest, you know, ways to think about this is, you know, and you know, I think car manufacturers have done this quite well. When you think about, you know, Volvo, you know, what is Volvo's brand concept, right? It's safety. When you think about Apple's brand concept, very much revolves on simplicity. Now their mission or their vision, you know, is making sure that everybody can be part of this future that they believe in and making their products quite accessible. So they've structured their brand concept very much about simplicity, making sure that, you know, everyone can access the technology and feel really comfortable with it. And, you know, we all know and have these wonderful stories of, you know, your grandparents using the iPhone and the iPad, and, you know, people that before couldn't really interact with technology in this very open, accessible way. So that, you know, very much speaks to their brand concept. These are questions that, you know, questions that we or actually things that we need to arrive at, or you need to arrive at as a brand.
Yeah, I was going to say, so establishing that is really the goal, right? Like we want the brand name to become synonymous in the mind with an idea. We want to effectively replace it, so that when you, in a very ideal scenario, when you think tissue paper, you think Kleenex or hygienic tissue paper, or when you think of a photocopy, you think of Xerox, right? Certainly best case scenarios, and then in more competitive markets, you know, you start to subdivide things a little bit more. But it's maybe not the first step, but it is the most important step to establish what that central idea is that is going to be woven through everything, and make sure that nobody else owns that idea already, because then you would be going against somebody that is already entrenched, they have resources, and they might already be first to mind with that concept. So it's two things. It's doing a bit of archaeology, finding what's there, basing the work on some fundamental truth, and making sure that it's competitive, right? That there's nobody else that is going after that.
Right. And if they are, then there's always the opportunity to create, you know, a new category, and competition in a category is very healthy because it drives attention to that, you know. So a lot of times people really focus on this idea of a market share and, you know, having, you know, as much market share as possible and cutting out the competition. And the reality is that the more competition you have, and, you know, you have Pepsi and Coca-Cola, right? Like, there's a classic, you know, example of Johnson & Johnson, like launching, you know, they're actually putting their their baby shampoo and targeting the adult, you know, shampoo category market. And I'd actually, you know, doing quite well, but not having done as well as it could have had there been, you know, other competitors that would have drawn more attention to this idea of, hey, you know, I can use this baby shampoo as an adult. It's quite sensitive for me. So, you know, there's these classic examples that, you know, point to that. So it's not to be disheartened to say like, hey, I can't do business because I can't own that category, for example. You can always come up with a new category if, you know, and understand that, you know, there will be, and that competition is healthy at the same time, and it draws more attention to the category. And that if you actually want to, you know, want to be successful, or as, you know, really kind of achieve as most success as possible, is, you know, draw attention to that need in that category, rather than your brand, because that will actually, you know, you'll get a bigger piece of the pie. So
I think that's a really important point, and it's a little counterintuitive. So I just wanted to throw out another example. Like, Art Basel is really successful because it takes all these galleries and puts them in one place, creates this insane competition, but because there's so many there, it draws a bigger market. So you definitely want a balance between market and competition. Mm-hmm. But, you know, if you have no competition, that's not desirable at all.
So I think out of this, like, let's call this your first phase of the process, that I think the goal, and especially in my former practice, it's really to have this guide so that you have something to measure against, so that, because there is this danger that once you have this information and there's like a really clear vision as to conceptually what this needs to be, there is that danger of things becoming subjective, right? Once we start to see things visual, and that is part of it, right? I mean, you may look at something and see something different than I do, because there is that, we're humans, right? And we bring a context when we're looking at something. But what I love about, and what's so important about going through the steps, these foundational first steps, is that you have something to measure against, and you can then begin to look at work that responds to it, and have something say, you know, does this work? Does this meet the goals? Does this look like what we're talking about, what conceptually we think this brand needs to be? Maybe you could speak a little bit about that next step, now that you have this information, and developing the visuals around it, and what that's like.
Yeah, so basically what we're talking about is articulating the brand, right? So we focus on right now a couple of constituent parts. Let's say the brand concept, your brand personality, and there are other components, you know, obviously, such as, you know, your brand vision and your brand behavior, and, you know, as I mentioned, mantra, et cetera. But now that we have all this information, right, and we can agree that, you know, essentially you're bringing it all together, because that's a big part of, you know, what is helpful in working, you know, with an agency rather than doing this yourself, right? That you have all these ideas oftentimes floating around, but you don't quite know what to do with them. And, you know, somebody comes in objectively and can really package these things and articulate them in a way that speaks truthfully to your brand. And, you know, we've seen, we've had very like emotive responses to this, because it's basically, you know, taking something that you've had, you know, a feeling and things that you've had floating around in your head, and articulating this in a very condensed and focused way. So now that we have this, you know, we then need to look at, our, you know, really a creative response to this, right? So how are we going to now dress up our brand accordingly so that it matches what we're saying we're really about? And more than even, you know, dress it up via way of colors and logos and things like that, how are we going to also communicate verbally so that we are consistent with what we're saying that we're really about? And I think that, you know, a great example that I just read about recently that will help you kind of visualize this is the Oatly campaign. You probably have seen all the Oatly ads floating around the bus benches and so forth. And there's an interesting case study with Oatly, because they actually, you know, spoke about not having a marketing department. Their creative is run by their in-house team, which basically, you know, writes the briefs and produces the creative and approves the creative. So they're not going through, you know, another kind of funnel, which, you know, oftentimes can, you know, kind of stand in the way of certain ideas, and because they're not safe, and, you know, mediocre ideas tend to test well, but not really great ones, right? So their whole thing, you know, with in terms of verbal communications, it's, you know, very much about having this like humility that associated with where they're from, which is Sweden, and playing off of that, not taking themselves too seriously. They also, you know, brag about not having this extensive verbal brand manual, but really thinking about their brand as the kind of brand that you'd want to hang out with, and, you know, you'd want to go out to drinks with on the weekends. And they've really formulated their entire messaging campaign in such a way where, you know, if you read their ads, they're really not taking themselves too seriously. It's very tongue-in-cheek. They're kind of even, you know, poking fun at themselves. And you know, it's an interesting case study in terms of, you know, how to achieve consistency with, you know, a brand that is claiming to be about, you know, about humility and, you know, not taking themselves so seriously, and you know, just kind of also breaking the rules. So, you know, again, going back to, once we have this blueprint, now we have to look at, you know, how is my visual style going to reinforce this and build on this? My photography, you know, my illustration, my color system, how is it, you know, going to be a signifier and, you know, all point to the same thing? How is my tone of voice, you know, the way that I speak, right? And, you know it from, you know, your friends, right? Like people that you relate with, you respect, you like, you know, there's a way about them, right, that is very consistent with their personality. When there isn't consistency, you tend to lose trust because you feel like, hey, someone isn't really being themselves, right? And it's the same with brands. So we have to look at making sure that you have this blueprint, and that, you know, as Sarah was saying, you're looking back to this as a guide and as something that you can hold everything up against. This becomes your Bible, and you can measure everything moving forward to that. And oftentimes, you know, like for example, the brand mantra is something that becomes quite useful because it effectively defines the scope of the brand. Brand mantras that, you know, might help you kind of understand things better. You know, for example, Starbucks, you know, rewarding everyday experiences. It's not their tagline, but it's something that, you know, speaks to this idea of the third place and, you know, the experience that you're supposed to have within a Starbucks. You know, for Nike, it's authentic athletic apparel, or authentic athletic performance, I believe. You know, so that speaks to the ethos of Nike in a big way. So, and everything that you see subsequently on a billboard through their messaging campaign, you know, for example, you know, this big kind of billboard that quite resonated with me from Nike said, you know, yesterday you said tomorrow, really speaks to this idea of this like authentic athletic performance and, you know, pushing you, you know, and not making excuses. You know, their visual style with photography, you see it very apparently with Apple as well. Being about simplicity, you can look at an Apple billboard, not even see the logo, and you know it's an Apple product, you know it's an Apple campaign, as you do with Nike. So
I think it's worth mentioning also that the way we work is we tend not to work from a subjective place. It's unavoidable, right? So everything is going to be influenced by the things that you've experienced throughout your life, but we don't start there. And the strategy really helps us not to go there unnecessarily. I think Erika mentioned that early on, like one of our biggest influence was Charles and Rita Eames, and there's a quote from them which is, "The degree to which a designer has a personal style is the degree to which they fail to solve a design problem," right? So obviously they had an approach, and you step back and you look at all of that and you see the results of it. There is a consistent language, but it's not what they were aiming at. Aesthetics really are the most superficial expression of the work that we do, and when it's best, it's really coming from the essential ideas and trying to communicate them in the most efficient way possible. And I think once you're working with a client that sees that and it sort of appreciates the efficiency of it, they start to feel very comfortable in letting you go and just run with it and see how far you can take it.
So I just happened to see in the chat there, someone asked a question, you know, can you talk about how this applies to very small businesses like interior designers, because they don't have the large advertising and marketing budgets? Maybe it's worth talking about some kind of key takeaways for designers of how they can take this process. And actually, side note, we have 6 degrees of separation. Brett Helsham is a really good friend of mine.
yeah, oh my God.
Yeah, right?
I saw that. She commented this morning on our Instagram. Yeah, I was like, oh my gosh, what a small world. Yeah.
And actually, I like Brett Helsham as a case study because, especially when it comes to tone of voice, you know, she's a small studio. She does a lot of work on her own. She has a couple of assistants, but you know, her look and feel is very consistent. And I'm always wearing like the consistency cap. And I've always also, my advice to designers who have small businesses is like, look, if you have a certain budget, put that time and money into a phase 1 in getting a really solid understanding of who you are and who you want to be, and get some of those like core foundational elements. And you know, in my own practice in consulting, you know, I didn't always have large clients. I had kind of a really wide range. So for those smaller clients, it's like, yes, we can talk about what your brand is and conceptualize it and get you some tools, but how do they use it? Because someone can't always hire me to do absolutely everything. So for that small shop interior designer, what are some strategies that you think for where should they be putting their dollars, and what brand tools should they be focusing on most?
Yeah, that's a great,
brand pencils and brand rulers. Those are big.
No, that's a great question, and I should preface this with saying that we work with clients of all sizes, and from people like Capital One, brands like Capital One, to a mom and pop getting started, and we love, and we don't really discriminate in terms of whether it's a small client or a large client. For us, we're equally excited. Especially if we get the opportunity to really help them, drive their brand forward in a meaningful way. I think for a small, studio who's starting out, yes, sure, doesn't have the Nike budget, things like that. You have to really sit down and, do a little bit of soul searching, and it's not difficult to, wrap your head around this idea of, what is my brand concept? But what is it that I stand for? And, start to think about anything that you're putting out, whether, even if you're doing your website on Squarespace, even if you are putting out, an email marketing campaign on MailChimp, making sure that you're not on automatic and you're sitting down to think about it before every action that you take. And there's a great Steve Jobs quotes, which I know you like to quote quite a bit about. Every time you put a new product out, you're making either an investment or a withdrawal on your brand. So everything that you, a deposit or withdrawal on your brand, every time you put anything out. So think about it, in terms of whether you're putting out, an Instagram post or you're putting out an email campaign. Is that a withdrawal or is that a deposit? And what determines if that's, a withdrawal, if it's something that is going against what your brand should really stand for. But you won't really know that until you take a little bit of time to think about and do a little bit of soul searching and figure out, okay, so what do we stand for? And is this consistent, right?
I think also, we went through that as an agency, right? Because as I mentioned, we were kind of growing into the branding side of it. I mean, obviously into the graphic design side of it also. I think it surprises a lot of people to hear that we fired most clients, like the vast majority of clients that we fired at the beginning when we weren't making any money. And the reason for that is, one is because the budgets weren't there to make us feel worried about firing a client, because they were paying us so little that whatever. And then the other thing is that we didn't have a focused portfolio at the time, so people didn't know what to expect from us. We didn't have a brand, right? As we progressed and our work started to come into focus as a body of work, then we started to attract more people that were interested in the same things that we were interested in. And that's also why we really don't discriminate between size of clients. What we're interested in is clients that are interested in the same things that we are, that are compelled by the same things that we are.
Right.
Because it helps build our portfolio. And I think that's something that a lot of creatives can relate to, is like, your portfolio is possibly the first and strongest piece of branding that you're going to put out there, and be fiercely protective about it. There's somebody I follow on YouTube who's a music composer, and he had this great, he had a lot of advice in this one video that he did, and I felt that it applied to a lot of creatives. And one of the things that he said, but his name is Christian Henson, by the way, and the video is called 100 Do's and Don'ts of Media Composition. And in it, he says, that bit of music that you're really proud of because it sounds like proper film music, take that completely off of your reel. And he's like, that other bit of music that you don't know what to do with because it doesn't sound like anything else, make that the first thing on your reel. And that really speaks to, I think, the sense of differentiation, right? Because we all know that when you start a company, you want to find a niche. You want to find a point of differentiation. But then suddenly when it comes time to develop a brand, everybody wants to be just like everybody else. And that's our job, is to really reinforce those ideas about individuality and nourish them and just build them up so that they are the most prominent thing. So in summary, I would say, think heavily about your portfolio, what people can extract from it, and what expectations they will have as a result of that.
Right. There's someone asking a question, if we could perhaps employ some concrete cases in the design world that might be helpful for designers. I know we mentioned
the topic of how to build up.
I guess it's about, you know.
I think you guys gave some really good concrete cases. It seems like a lot of designers are interested in really tangible resources. My daughter just got into her online class. Everyone share the joy. This last question was, are you able to provide resources for small businesses who cannot afford a brand strategist, websites, books, I guess some reference points?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, the 22 Immutable Laws of Branding by Al Ries are really helpful. It's a big do's and don'ts on branding. But I think most recently, Simon Sinek, Starting with the Why, is a great reference. It's a short read, but a dense one, and it really helps you wrap your head around having a belief system and how charismatic brands work. So, you know, if you really want to start to understand, you know, what it is, how people connect emotionally with brands, and what it is that drives people to really develop this kind of cult-like following, he, you know, breaks down examples from people like Martin Luther King, you know, to actual, you know, brands like Apple. But really all comes down to the same thing, right? Like, and this, you know, he talks about this thing called the golden circle, which is starting with the why, as opposed to starting with what you do and developing that belief system. So, you know, that's a great resource in terms of knowledge. In terms of, you know, the mechanical, of course, you know, obviously that's something that, you know, you need, you know, you need to work with a graphic designer on. But yeah, I think.
I mean, if you're a designer, we are really interested in a lot of design just across a broad spectrum, and there's so much crossover that I think the trick is really understanding where the similarities are. Like you can draw, for me, I think my father's an architect, so I remember early on him explaining to me that ornamentation that comes from structure is more desirable than ornamentation that's superficial, right? So Eiffel Tower is a great example of a structure that the beauty is from the most fundamental components, right? And translating that into design, I look at the work that we do, and it's mostly text-based. Whenever we're working on a graphic, we always start with text, and that is, I think that's just intuitive, but also objectively, you can say that is one of the most fundamental aspects of what we're doing. So if you can speak with the most essential elements, it's more preferable. Another example which sort of feeds into that is a quote, I think it's from Borges. He said something to the effect of, if you can say something with 5 words, don't use 10, right? And that's like, it's a very typical thing in writing, but it also speaks to the sense of understanding structure and working with essential elements. So if we're talking about people that are already in the design community, I would say that you probably have more tools at your disposal than you realize. You just have to start to make the connection with how they translate into other areas of design.
Yeah, and you know, aside from, you know, this is for Lisa, who I know posted the question. So, you know, the 22 Immutable Laws of Branding and Start with the Why, but also we are in such a great, you know, period right now. I'm thinking back, you know, 20 years, for example, even then, and you're so much more informed and than you know it, you know, in just looking at, you know, brands that are doing things. And, you know, obviously thanks to social media and having all this accessibility now that, you know, we maybe didn't have 20 years ago, but really being able to see how, you know, certain brand, like observe how, you know, charismatic brands, you know, are behaving, and seeing that there's an underlying thread and a consistency in what they're doing, that you don't have to be an Apple or a Nike to do it. You can be a, you know, a 1 or 2 person, you know, studio, but still achieve that consistency. And I think that process of observation is something not to be underestimated. Like, yeah, sure, there's a plethora, you know, of books that you can, you know, read, and, you know, things that you can watch, but you know, we've also learned quite a bit by process of observation, you know, and even just looking at other designers like Charles and Ray Eames, who, you know, established themselves as a strong brand. You know, I think, you know, those are kind of great examples not to be underestimated, you know, this process of observation and seeing, you know, what is it that they're doing, and, you know, that's really contributing.
Yeah, just to, you know, punctuate that, like, if you're a writer, you have to read. If you are a musician, you dissect works of music. If you're a painter, you look at other paintings. If you're building brands, you're dissecting other brands.
So is there anything else in the chat? I just posted the title of the book, The 22 Immutable Laws of Branding. Paulette was asking for that.
And start with the why. And there's a great TED Talk on, you know, if you Google Simon Sinek TED Talk, Great Leaders Inspire Action, he basically, you know, takes like the entire book and just condenses it into that short TED Talk, and really breaks down. And to me, that's a really great resource, you know, for us, you know, really talks about the golden circle and how charismatic brands behave, and developing this belief system and connecting with people on an emotional level. And these are the things that, you know, we talk to our clients about, like, how do you, you know, you hear the word narrative being, you know, agencies, you know, use it all the time. What exactly does that mean? Like, I have to build a narrative, you know, really, you know, it's about creating something meaningful that people can connect with emotionally. And in order to have that, you know, you also need to arrive at some, you know, some brand truth. But yeah, I would say that's definitely a great resource. Google the Simon Sinek Great Leaders Inspire Action. It's a great TED Talk that, you know, is highly informative if you're in that soul searching process. Because even if you have the budget to hire an agency, it's something that you should still go through and understand, you know, yourself as a business owner, you know, regardless of whether you have the budget, you know, for someone to do it or not. So,
and I think to kind of bring this back to Stephanie and Lisa's comments, just from a small business perspective, this is kind of very simple advice that I would give, is that, you know, consistency is key, and that regardless of what your brand looks like, all those touch points are opportunities to be remembered in a consistent way. So look, this is pretty down and dirty, but every single piece, every label, every email signature across your office, every envelope, you know, this sounds very basic to us, something that we do in our sleep, but these things matter when communicating your company.
Yeah, and don't underestimate even a proposal, you know, like, you know, like the smallest thing, you know, the label that you put on something, like,
yeah,
you know, this attention to detail. If you know, I once heard about, I think it was the Four Seasons, you know, and how, you know, which is quite a strong hospitality brand, having a really kind of anal guide as to, you know, the height at which, you know, the shades need to be at in their hotels, you know, things like that. You know, we have a kind of our strict, even internal guide with, you know, how we receive clients and what kind of presentation, you know, we have at the table in terms of, you know, drinks and, you know, how things are served and things like that. And all those little things are, like Sarah said, they're touch points, they're details, but they're important.
Yeah. I remember I heard this interview. I think they were talking to, who were they talking to? I think they were talking to Ron Wood from the Rolling Stones, and he was talking about, like, Keith Richards at the sound check being annoyed because the keyboards were too high in the mix. And he said, this is a rock and roll band, you hear the guitars first. And I think that's why so many people, when they think of that band, they think of him, because he's sort of he's sort of the guardian of that aspect of it, right? They've gone on, they've done different things. They did for Satanic Majesties, whatever. But really, when they're effective, they're very focused in this one narrow area, and that's true of most music, right? There's this great quote from Jerry Garcia. He said, "You don't want to be the best at what you do. You want to be the only person doing what you do." Right? So that sense of focusing in on what makes you unique, not what makes you good, but what makes you unique, is that alone is tremendously difficult. Like it requires a considerable amount of focus and diligence to just stay on track. So all these things, all these books and all these tools for branding, they're fine, but they're kind of like, they're like learning scales. Until you internalize them to the point where you don't need to think about them, they're gonna feel a little forced, which is why whether you're engaging an agency or not, like, it's really a good idea to try and become as familiar with it as possible and understand the mechanics behind it so that it can just flow out of you naturally.
Do we have any more questions? I don't think we've answered them.
We've answered most of them, yeah. Oh, wait, one just came through. Oh, so Melanie has said that looks like Lemon Yellow has worked with some talented interior designers and architects. Definitely share some of their websites for R&D. Smiley face.
Well, thank you, Melanie, Ryan. Yeah, so we're actually going to be rolling out, during COVID, we worked with some, interior designers and architects that were not yet ready to roll out their sites. One of the things we've learned working with architects particularly, they have different timelines. So I remember when we were first approached to do a rebrand for an architect, they asked us if the process would take about a couple of years, and we totally, it completely caught us off guard. But, because obviously the process does not take 2 years, but yeah, so we're in the process of, rolling out some new stuff, which, we're happy to, we'll be check our Instagram, and, we'll be posting that stuff soon, particularly an interior designer, which we just rebranded, and another architecture studio. And then, yeah, we've worked in terms of collaborated with, people like OMA and BRK, so, Shohei Shigematsu and BRK Ingalls, Renee Gonzalez, which is, a very, very talented architect in Miami, just to name a few. But yeah.
Yeah, we love working with architects. It's, we speak the same language.
Well, yeah, and designers, I think, just as well. I mean, there's definitely, yeah, there's that similar language, understanding the process. That's, quite key.
We did an exhibition called Inventory. We did 4 of them. Was it 2013? Was it?
Yeah, I think 2012, 2013, yeah.
And that was really interesting because it sort of introduced us to a world of industrial designers, and we got on with them really well. And I think from then on, the studio has always done a lot of work in the design related field, and it's a lot of fun for us. I definitely think it's where we feel, I don't want to say most comfortable, but we definitely thrive in that environment.
It's a pleasure to work with clients. When I was in branding, you get the products, services, and then design, right? And you're right, we speak this common language, and there already is part of that learning curve is removed because we have our own creative processes and can respect and understand that as well. So it's so challenging to work on the service side where you're trying to, establish a brand for something that isn't tangible. So it's so much fun it was fun for me back when I was doing that kind of work to work with other designers as well. So it looks like Andrew has popped on.
Hey, I just wanted to thank everyone for signing up and registering and attending. And I wanted to thank our wonderful speakers today, because I think you've shared a lot of really valuable information.
Well, thank you. Yeah, this has been awesome. If you have any other questions, feel free to just reach out to us directly. You can email hello@lemonyellow.com. Also check us out at lemonyellow.com. But we're happy to answer any other questions that might pop up afterwards.
Erika, maybe we should send in the chat just our information.
Oh, yeah, that's a great idea. I'll do. Yeah.
Perfect.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for having us.
Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone. Bye, Sarah.
Cool.
Hi, good to chat with you guys.